The Pentagon's carefully concealed plan for a ground invasion of Iran has finally been exposed in the most absurd way possible. Washington was just releasing smokescreens about withdrawing troops within 3 weeks. But right on its heels, it was uncovered that lower-ranking soldiers are secretly and desperately eating their last meals. In fact, the Washington Post astutely pointed out earlier that the Pentagon had been plotting a ground operation for a full-scale invasion of Iran for months, and now a viral video on TikTok has completely torn off this hypocritical veil of secrecy. The whistleblower is not some high-level hacker nor an intelligence officer, but a stripper who has worked near the U.S. military's Camp Pendleton for decades. According to her, in half a lifetime of working in the industry, it is the first time she has seen these young soldiers, who usually budget carefully even for a glass of beer, display such morbid madness. The whole private room was filled with foul smoke in an instant, as these young Marines seemed to be hollowing out their souls, frantically venting their fears, until they did not even have the strength left to give the middle finger to the poster of the commander-in-chief on the wall. In just one night of taking refuge, she completed the performance quota of the past several months. It's really just a lack of military discipline. You might as well do the math. A regular U.S. military E3 level private first class has a monthly base salary of just over $2,300, leaving very little after taxes. But on this night of carnival, they did not hesitate to squander their savings, tipping like money-scattering boys. History is always strikingly similar, which cannot help but remind people of the Saigon bars on the eve of the 1968 Vietnam War Tet Offensive, when American soldiers also exhausted their wealth in the exact same way, trying to grasp the last trace of warmth belonging to the living amidst the despair of certain death. What on earth did the officers order them to do to make these young men, who should be full of vigor, know that this journey is a near certain death, so much so that they do not even want to leave a single return check? The politicians at the Pentagon are like bloodshot gamblers sitting at a Texas Hold'em poker table. Only the chips they casually throw onto the table to bet are these breathing, bleeding American youths. These soldiers at the bottom empty their pockets just to buy a brief illusion of survival before the Russian roulette of fate stops spinning. When the highest military secret of a superpower is reduced to being revealed by a club stripper, it shows that what is completely rotten to the core is not only the Pentagon's useless secrecy system, but also the moral bottom line of this massive war machine. Seeing this, some viewers in front of the screen might disagree and ask in return, how could the U.S. military, the strongest heavenly troops on the blue planet, feel despair over a war that has not even started yet? Indeed, if your understanding of the U.S. military is still stuck in the individual heroism myth of Rambo holding a machine gun against 100 enemies in first blood, or if your mind is still replaying the crushing victory of the Gulf War that woke up the whole world, as if that scene of vibrant vitality is still right before your eyes, then you have most likely been blinded by Hollywood filters. Why are even internal think tanks in Washington now anxiously talking about the U.S. military being trapped to death in the Middle East, as if this ancient Persian battlefield is destined to be a deadly trap with little hope of survival? Because the underlying logic supporting the myth that the U.S. military is invincible is collapsing. Whether it was the cruel trenches of World War I or the dimensional strike of the Gulf War, there is only one prerequisite for the U.S. military to win a beautiful battle. And that is under the condition that air supremacy is completely crushed, and aerial gunships can be called in as easily as ordering takeout. Since ancient times, no one is immortal in the meat grinder of war, and American soldiers are also made of flesh and blood. Everyone carries one head on two shoulders. What truly saves them from massive casualties is the astronomical level of technological blessing, and without these technological umbrellas, the actual combat capability of the U.S. military without air superiority might not be much stronger than militias wearing slippers. We can open a deliberately downplayed historical archive. During the Iraq War, an extremely ironic battle took place. At that time, a fully staffed U.S. military company of over 200 people encountered unknown firepower resistance in front of an unremarkable building. What do you guess these elites armed to the teeth did? They were completely blocked outside the building for a day and a night, and absolutely no one dared to launch a close-range tactical assault. Ultimately, like frightened giant babies, they called in 3 whole rounds of high-intensity aerial fire support until fighter jets completely blew up that building. And when the tactical squad flipped through the scorched ruins for a battle damage assessment, a comical scene appeared. Underneath lay shockingly only one corpse of an anti-American militant and an AK-47 that was almost rusting. This is the true face of the U.S. military ground forces after stripping away their high-tech outer garments. A full 20 years have passed, and they are still unable to extricate themselves from deep path dependence, continuing to use that spoiled soldier tactic of hiding and calling for support. However, if Washington insists on pressing the war button, this set of tactics will completely turn into a deadly joke on the Iranian battlefield. Facing Iran's unfathomable air defense network and complex terrain, the U.S. military will face the most terrifying actual combat instance since World War II. If the U.S. military war machine is compared to a muscular behemoth covered in high-tech catheters, maintaining its decency by injecting air supremacy nutrient fluid, then Iran's air defense network is a fatal slaughterhouse that ruthlessly pulls out all the catheters. The heavenly troops who have lost their air cover are nothing more than moving targets wearing expensive bulletproof vests. The bubble of the Gulf War myth will eventually be smashed to pieces on the reefs of the Persian Gulf. Some people might compare this potentially explosive beach landing to those epic battles of World War II. But the cruel reality is that whether it is the Normandy landing or the bloody Battle of Iwo Jima, in the face of this upcoming fierce Persian battle, they simply look like Boy Scout child's play. Why say so? Open the topographic map of the Middle East and you will feel despair. Back then, storming Omaha Beach indeed resulted in heavy casualties, but as long as the American soldiers gritted their teeth and climbed onto that beachhead, what they faced was the boundless Great Plains of Western Europe, where the torrent of steel could gallop freely. And what about Iran? More than 50% of this country's territory is covered by rugged mountains, especially the Zagros Mountains stretching along the coast of the Persian Gulf, with an average elevation approaching 3,000 meters, acting like a natural wall of size. Iran's pitifully small plain areas are all frustratingly squeezed into that tiny, narrow strip of empty land along the coast. Under such terrain, the U.S. military's proud M1 Abrams main battle tanks simply cannot drive in, and the massive armored units can only be crowded on the narrow beachhead, unable to move. Meanwhile, the opponent only needs to set up heavy machine guns and anti-tank missiles on the mountainside with a wide field of vision, conducting fire coverage from a commanding height. Just imagine when those infantries lacking ground armor cover are forced to assault concrete bunkers from an unshielded beachhead. What kind of one-sided massacre will the U.S. military face? However many human lives were thrown into Omaha Beach back then, this time facing this ancient Persian battlefield, the Pentagon will have to prepare double the number of body bags. What is even more suffocating is that the trump cards held in Iran's hands are far more than just a few heavy machine guns. Yes, after years of blockades and suppression, Iran's conventional heavy weapon inventory may have bottomed out. But you must never underestimate the war wisdom that an industrialized country can erupt with in a desperate situation. They possess spine-chilling, low-cost weapons of mass destruction, and they come in massive, unlimited quantities. You can close your eyes and imagine such a battlefield scene. Robot dogs carrying assault rifles shuttling silently through the ruins, discovering U.S. troops and executing indiscriminate violent killings. Suicide trucks loaded with dozens of kilograms of high explosive materials rushing toward U.S. military assembly points like ghosts, and densely packed in the sky are the famous Shahd series suicide drones and completely unavoidable fiber optic drones. Here, we must review a piece of history deliberately hidden by the U.S. military. As early as the 2002 Millennium Challenge large-scale military exercise, retired General Paul Van Riper, playing the imaginary enemy, used low-cost asymmetric tactics like small boat swarms and suicide drones to sink 16 main U.S. warships, including an aircraft carrier on the very first day of the war, resulting in 20,000 U.S. troops killed in action. This simulation, which made the top brass of the Pentagon lose all face, is now weirdly repeating itself in reality along the coast of Iran. A suicide drone costing a mere $20,000 can easily trade for a multi-million-dollar armored vehicle of the U.S. military, or even dozens of fresh lives cultivated at immense expense. With this extremely distorted financial exchange ratio, I have to ask the politicians in Washington, can your debt-ridden Treasury Department really bear it? The strategy of storming Iran is like driving a diamond-studded Ferrari at full speed into a Persian swamp covered with cheap anti-tank mines. No matter how much your engine roars, you will ultimately be swallowed by the mud and fire, leaving absolutely nothing behind. In the face of absolute geographical chasms and asymmetric wars of attrition, a military myth built with U.S. dollars is nothing but a paper tiger full of holes. Truly cruel war never cares how many zeros are on your military spending bill. It only cares how many cold graves this land has prepared. This impromptu military gamble is like an absurd one-man show with no one to foot the bill. This sudden operation not only lacks any endorsement authorized by the UN Security Council, but even the gentlemen on Capitol Hill in the US have not approved a single cent of special budget for it. Look at those supposedly rock-solid allies of Washington. Across the Atlantic, the top diplomats of Britain, France, and Germany spoke out in tacit agreement, almost at the same time, clearly stating that they will absolutely not participate in any unilateral action by the U.S. military in Iran. And what about that diehard little brother Israel, who has always been domineering in the Middle East? Tel Aviv's reaction is even more brilliant. They keenly smelled the bloody scent of the beach landing and turned their guns around early on to strike surrounding armed groups. This makes it blatantly clear that they do not want to be tied to this chariot heading for the cliff, refusing to get involved in this meat grinder destined for a one-sided massacre. The collective defection of allies is somewhat understandable, but the internal collapse of the U.S. military is what is truly shocking. Can you believe it? When they learned that the big one was coming, the U.S. Navy internally staged a ridiculously funny self-destruct drama. To avoid going to war, the officers and men on the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, actually started to commit sabotage on their own ship. Those who should start fires started fires, and those who should block toilets blocked toilets, forcefully trying to turn this weapon of the state, which cost over $10 billion, into a pile of scrap iron first. With a meager salary of only $3,000 a month, why should they risk their lives in the Persian Gulf for politicians? For these officers and men who know the inside story, even being sent to a military court for disciplinary violations is far better than being thrown into that sea locked onto by anti-aircraft missiles to die. Therefore, when all avenues of retreat are blocked, and when all the glamorous branches of the military find excuses to shrink back, this suicidal errand ultimately fell with no other choice onto the heads of those over 50,000 Marine Corps soldiers. In the Pentagon's strict chain of contempt, they are called the fourth-class citizens, and are even jokingly referred to internally as bullet sponges. Also belonging to the U.S. Department of the Navy and in the same naval sequence, the treatment is a terrifying difference between clouds and mud. If you open the historical budget tables of the U.S. Department of Defense, you will find that the Marine Corps has only been allocated a pitiful single-digit percentage of military spending year-round. Other Air Force or Navy branches stay in absolutely safe rear base camps, enjoying the top-tier resource allocation. Even when war breaks out, it is nothing more than pressing the missile launch buttons a few times in front of a screen, and in their spare time they can even squat on the deck leisurely fishing and drinking coffee. And what about this group of abandoned Marines? From the bloody island-hopping battles in the Pacific theater of World War II to the cruel street fighting in Fallujah, Iraq, they always eat the worst food in the entire army, take the most severe beatings, suffer endless physical and mental torment, and ultimately are reduced to the cheapest cannon fodder in landing battles. The more dangerous a suicide mission that no one else dares to take is, the more it is tailor-made specifically for these bottom-tier soldiers. So these Marines at the bottom are not stupid. When they realize the wind is blowing the wrong way and fully understand that, in front of a sky full of suicide drones, the Grim Reaper will never distinguish whether you have money in your pocket or not, they simply chose a doomsday carnival of getting drunk today while there is wine today. Squandering everything thoroughly, are they supposed to hold hands and devoutly recite the Bible before they die? America's chariot of hegemony is now like a Titanic crashing at full speed into a Persian iceberg. Politicians and senior generals have already allocated the lifeboats in the first-class cabins, while those 50,000 lower-level soldiers known as fourth-class citizens are firmly locked in the freezing lower decks, forced to use their own flesh and blood to fuel the furnace of imperial power. When a superpower's last ounce of confidence at the poker table needs to be exchanged by selling the blood of its lowest-tier soldiers, the outcome of this war is no longer a question of whether it can be won, but rather how much longer this empire can linger on its last breath. Even if these bottom-tier soldiers are lucky enough to leave a whole corpse under the strangulation of drones, do you think the politicians in Washington will show mercy and send their families a generous pension? Do not be naive. Here we must tear off the Pentagon's most hypocritical fig leaf, which is the U.S. military's extremely harsh and cold-blooded criteria for judging a soldier's death in action. Ever since the Iraq War, the U.S. military has tacitly executed the so-called three principles, meaning that a soldier must die from enemy fire, must die before reaching a medical facility, and most importantly, the remains must be clearly identifiable to be officially recognized as killed in action. What does this mean? This means that if a Marine on the beach is directly hit by Iran's large-caliber heavy weapons, instantly vaporized or blown into a pile of fragments from which fingerprints cannot be extracted, then on the military's casualty report, he will most likely only receive a cold verdict, missing in action. Without a certificate of death in action, his wife and children far away at home will not be able to get that maximum life insurance of hundreds of thousands of dollars and can only suffer desperately in endless waiting and poverty. And what about those survivors who are lucky enough to crawl out of the piles of dead bodies in the Persian Gulf and return home with broken bodies? What awaits them is not the flowers of heroes, but the second half of a meat grinder carefully designed by capital. According to a recent statistic from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, on any given night there are over 30,000 military veterans living on the streets across the U.S. The vast majority of them accurately stepped into the trap of PTSD and were completely sucked dry by exorbitant bills tailor-made by medical capital. Warriors who once risked their lives for the country ultimately watched helplessly as their houses were forcibly taken away by banks because they could not afford the sky-high costs of antidepressants and psychotherapy, reducing them to homeless people beside bustling streets. If you were an ordinary soldier at Camp Pendleton and looking back, all you saw were the profoundly bleak aftermaths of your predecessors. What mood would you still have to fight for politicians? What is even more fatal than corrupted military discipline is the total collapse of faith at the bottom of this army. The former U.S. military could at least write anti-fascism into history books during World War II and use freedom and democracy as a signboard during the Cold War. But today, these young people have absolutely no idea what they are fighting for. Rushing to the ancient Persian battlefield tens of thousands of miles away to slaughter a group of people with whom they have no grievances. Is it ultimately for the midterm election votes of that amateur president in the White House, or for the skyrocketing cash on the financial reports of arms giants? You see, right as the situation in the Middle East became tense, the stock prices of military-industrial complexes like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon immediately surged in response. Those professional bureaucrats who truly understand geopolitics and military affairs have long been driven out of the center of power, leaving behind a group of yes-men who only know how to flatter, treating the ground war in Iran, which they do not even dare to touch in war games, as a crazy gamble to exchange for their political futures. So looking back again at the group of soldiers indulging themselves in the strip club at the beginning, how is that a corruption of military discipline that is clearly using carnival to numb the extreme sorrow right before the Grim Reaper knocks on the door? These bottom-tier soldiers are like cheap blood bags drained dry by Washington, stuffed into the bottomless pit of geopolitics while alive, and having their last ounce of surplus value squeezed dry by medical and military-industrial capital after they die. On Capital's ledger, the dry bones of 10,000 soldiers can never compare to a single jumping decimal point in the financial reports of military-industrial giants. And when a great power needs to rely on sacrificing the lives of its young people to maintain the fading glow of hegemony, the twilight of the empire has already descended irretrievably.